Thank you to Mr. William Carter from Texas for sending me such a meaningful story by email. Tonight, Dust and Destiny will share with you a true tale, based on the words he sent to our channel. They dragged her across the dirt of the marketplace, iron shackles biting into her wrists until the skin split and bled. The crowd of Copper Creek gathered not out of pity, but out of a morbid curiosity that always seemed to thrive when someone else's suffering was on display. Mothers held their children close, fathers leaned on their rifles, and every pair of eyes fixed on the broken figure of a woman who had once been their pride. Now she was nothing more than an offering, tribute for the Apache warrior the settlers called the Blood Hunter. But when the warrior finally stepped from the shadows, tall and scarred by years of battle, he did not see a prize, he did not see a burden. He saw something far more dangerous in a land where justice bent beneath the weight of money and fear. He saw a spirit unbroken. Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, was never a place of mercy. It was a settlement built on dust and ambition, where the red earth gave little and the desert sun took much. Its few streets were lined with weathered saloons, a half-stocked general store, a one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a chapel, and houses that leaned like tired men at the end of a long shift in the mines. Life here was harsh, and the law, such as it was, answered not to fairness, but to the heavy purse of the cattle barons. At the center of this storm stood Clara Morrison. She had come west from Missouri with nothing but a letter of recommendation, a few books tucked into her trunk, and a heart that believed knowledge could tame the frontier. For a time, she succeeded. She taught children their letters, read them Shakespeare by lamplight, and stitched together something resembling hope in a place where hope was often scarce. The townsfolk respected her then, perhaps even admired her, for her gentle ways and her quiet strength. But in the West, a woman's reputation was as fragile as glass, and once it cracked, it rarely held together again. When lies began to spread, they spread like prairie fire, quick, merciless, impossible to contain. A boy with a famous last name and a dangerous appetite told the town that Clara had led him astray. He had stolen money, but said she was the reason. And when he pointed his finger at her, the people of Copper Creek nodded along. It was easier to condemn the teacher than to face the truth about the cattleman's son. So the town cast her out. They stripped away her dignity piece by piece, until finally, in their desperation to save themselves from the Apache rider waiting on the ridge, they chose her as the price of peace. In that moment, Clara Morrison ceased to be a teacher, or a neighbor, or even a woman with a name. She became a sacrifice. Clara Morrison had not been born for dust and exile. She came west with the kind of hope that still clung to the young nation's spirit, that belief that on the frontier, a single determined heart could make a difference. When she arrived in Copper Creek, she stepped down from the stagecoach with her head held high, a battered trunk in her hand, and a single, well-worn volume of Shakespeare pressed close to her chest. That book had belonged to her late father, and she carried it as though the words themselves might light her path through the wilderness. The townsfolk had welcomed her then. The mayor shook her hand. Mothers whispered about how nice it would be to have a proper school teacher, and even the miners, rough and unshaven, tipped their hats when she passed. Clara was young, bright-eyed, and filled with the conviction that education was the salve for every wound the West could inflict. For a while, she was right. Children who had never held a book before learned their letters beneath her steady guidance. Boys who had spent their lives breaking horses discovered the thrill of words leaping off the page. Girls who were destined for kitchens and washboards found in Clara's classroom the courage to dream of something greater. At night, she read Shakespeare by lamplight, and though the children did not always understand the words, they understood the music in her voice. But Copper Creek was a place where fortunes shifted like desert sand. In a town where power belonged to cattle and silver, one whispered accusation could carry more weight than a library of truth. The trouble began with Jonathan Wade, the youngest son of Harrison Wade, the richest rancher in the territory, and the man whose wealth and influence reached into every corner of Copper Creek. Jonathan was 16, spoiled by money and forever in the shadow of a father who expected him to be more than he was. He came to Clara's schoolhouse after hours, asking for help with his reading. She believed him. She wanted to help. And for a few weeks, she did. But Jonathan's visits were not about books. He used them as cover for darker pursuits. While the town thought him a diligent student, he was in the saloons of Tucson, gambling away the money he had stolen from his father's safe. And when his crimes were discovered, he pointed a trembling finger at the easiest target he could find. "She made me do it," he stammered before his father and the sheriff. "Miss Morrison, she said she needed the money. She told me if I cared for her, I would take it." A single lie, born of fear, but it spread faster than fire in dry grass. By the time Clara learned what had been said, it was too late. The town whispered. Mothers pulled their children close. Fathers scowled when she walked by. Her schoolhouse door, once filled with eager faces, stood empty. She protested, of course. She begged for reason, for someone, anyone, to believe her. But in Copper Creek, the word of Harrison Wade's son carried more weight than the word of a schoolteacher with no family, no husband, and no allies. The fall was swift and merciless. She was dismissed from her post, cast out from the tiny room she had been given behind the schoolhouse, and left to fend for herself in a town that had turned to stone. For 3 months, she endured what most would not survive. She scrubbed saloon floors for scraps of food. She washed the clothes of women who paid her pennies and looked at her as though she were diseased. At night, she slept wherever she could, an abandoned chicken coop, the back room of the blacksmith shop, or beneath the pitiless stars, clutching her meager possessions to her chest. Hunger gnawed at her bones. Dignity fled. And still, she clung to the memory of children's laughter in the schoolhouse, as if the sound alone could keep her spirit from breaking. The final blow came with bread. She had gone 3 days with nothing but water from the trough. Desperation drove her behind the Henley bakery, where stale loaves were discarded to the pigs. She dug through refuse with trembling hands until Mrs. Henley herself found her. "Thief!" the woman shrieked, her voice cutting across the town like a blade. Within minutes, half of Copper Creek gathered to watch the spectacle. They came not to help, but to see the once respected teacher on her knees, clutching crumbs like a beggar. Sheriff Tom Brennan, brother-in-law to Harrison Wade, arrived with a smirk. He snapped the iron shackles onto Clara's wrists as though amused by the theater of it all. "Seems to me," he said loudly, "the town's been too generous already. Best we put an end to this trouble once and for all." Those words sealed her fate. 3 days earlier, an Apache warrior had been spotted on the ridge above Copper Creek. He sat his paint horse in silence, carrying a lance decorated with feathers and what settlers swore were human scalps. They called him Nahuel, the blood hunter. To the townsfolk, he was less man than myth, a shadow that haunted the desert, a savage who could strike without sound, whose arrows found their mark in darkness. 7 cavalry patrols had gone after him in the past 2 years. None returned. When he appeared outside Copper Creek, the town's leaders panicked. They convened in Harrison Wade's parlor, the sheriff, the mayor, the storekeeper, the mine foreman, men with soft hands who spoke of sacrifice as though it were a business deal. "He's waiting for something," Wade said, his voice tight with fear. "Apache don't just sit and watch. He's scouting, or he's demanding tribute." And then Brennan, ever calculating, smiled. "Maybe we can give him what he wants, or at least what he'll take." The men understood. Within that smoke-filled room, the decision was made. Clara Morrison would be handed over. No trial, no defense. She would be the offering, the token of peace to buy their own safety. Now she stood on the platform outside Henley's store, wrists shackled, hair matted, her once proud figure reduced to spectacle. The townsfolk gathered, some ashamed, some eager. Mrs. Henley stood at the front, flushed with righteous satisfaction. "She should have thought about consequences," the woman called. "This is what comes of corruption." Then the crowd parted and he came. Nahuel. He moved like smoke, silent but undeniable. 6 feet tall, lean as a wolf, his skin bronzed by the desert sun, marked with scars that told of battles survived. His hair was long, braided with feathers and bones. His eyes, dark, still, and utterly without fear, swept the platform, and for a moment, The whole town held its breath. Sheriff Brennan stepped forward, puffed up with false confidence. "We offer tribute," he declared. "This woman, convicted of theft and moral corruption, is presented to you as compensation for peace." Nawel looked at Clara. He looked into her eyes. Not at her torn dress, not at the chains, not at the humiliation etched into her posture, into her eyes. "You offer me your garbage," he said at last, his English accented but precise. The words fell like stones. "A woman you have already thrown away. Do you think this will buy your safety?" The crowd shifted uneasily. Brennan forced a laugh. "She's guilty under our law. She deserves punishment. We offer her to you." Nawel's laugh was quiet, more dangerous than any shout. "Your law," he said. "The law that steals land, breaks treaties, and calls it justice." His gaze returned to Clara. "But I will take her, not as tribute, not as payment, I will take her because she is the only thing of value here, a person wronged by the same injustice that destroys my people." With a motion too swift to follow, he drew a knife and cut the rope that tethered her chains. Gasps rippled through the crowd. He turned to Clara. His voice softened. "Can you ride?" She nodded, though her throat was dry. A second horse appeared, a sorrel mare, hidden until now. Nawel handed her the reins. "You have a choice," he said. "Come with me freely, or stay here and face their justice. Choose quickly. My patience is thin." Clara looked at the crowd. Faces that once smiled at her, now twisted in fear and disdain. People who would rather see her destroyed than admit their own cowardice. Then she looked at Nawel, whose reputation painted him a monster, but whose eyes, for the first time in months, offered her something she thought she had lost forever. A choice. She mounted the horse, and Copper Creek watched in silence as the blood hunter rode away with the woman they had chosen as sacrifice, leaving behind nothing but dust and shame. And now, dear listeners, I ask you, if the whole town had turned against you, would you stay behind to fight for a name already ruined? Or would you ride into the desert with a man feared as a savage killer, but who at least offered you the dignity of deciding your own fate? The desert was no gentle companion. Its beauty lay in cruelty. The way the sun bled the horizon into fire each evening, the way the wind cut the skin raw, the way thirst was never fully quenched. Clara Morrison felt every ache of it as she rode beside Nawel. Her wrists still bore the raw impressions of shackles, but the tighter weight was the silence, broken only by hoofbeats and the whisper of the desert itself. For hours he did not speak. He rode like a shadow, his posture steady, his eyes scanning every rise and ridge as if the earth itself might turn hostile at any moment. Clara had expected a monster. Stories told her he was a butcher, a demon draped in feathers. Instead, she found herself following a man who treated his horse with tenderness, who handed her water without hesitation, who carried himself with the quiet patience of one long accustomed to hardship. At last, when they stopped beneath a red sandstone bluff to rest, he spoke. His English was clear, measured, and bitter all at once. "I was 7, he said, when soldiers came for me. Mission school, they called it. Education, civilization. They gave me a new name, Joseph. Beat me when I spoke Apache. Taught me to pray to their God, to despise my people's tongue, to forget my own mother's songs. 8 years in that place, long enough to learn their language, their law, and the truth. I was never meant to belong, not to them, not even fully to my own." Clara listened, silent. His voice carried no self-pity, only the blunt weight of fact. She thought of her own exile in Copper Creek, the lies, the whispers, the way the town turned its back. She had tasted shame, but not like this. Not the theft of childhood itself. "You hate them," she said softly. "I do not hate," Nawel corrected. "Hate is a chain heavier than the one they put on your wrists. I remember, I survive, and I use what I know." Before she could answer, a sound carried on the desert wind. Thin, sharp, impossible to mistake. The cry of a child. Nawel froze. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. Then without a word, he spurred his horse toward the sound. Clara followed, her heart hammering. They crested a ridge and the sight below rooted her blood cold. A homestead burned, flames twisting skyward, smoke blotting the morning sun. Chickens screeched from a collapsed coop. The barn lay half consumed, and bodies were scattered across the yard. Adults cut down where they fought. A boy of perhaps 16 lying sprawled with a rifle still clenched in his hands. But the crying was not from the dead. Nawel pointed toward the root cellar, its wooden doors smoldering, smoke seeping out. Clara's breath caught. "They're alive," she whispered. In a blur of motion, Nawel was off his horse, sprinting toward the cellar. The heat seared, but he seized the iron handles and wrenched the doors open despite the metal burning his palms. A roar of smoke poured upward, choking, suffocating. "Stay here," he barked to Clara. But she was already moving. "No, they'll need a voice that doesn't frighten them." He glanced at her once, then nodded sharply. "Stay behind me." They descended into a nightmare. The cellar was choked with smoke, shadows trembling in the flicker of firelight. 3 children huddled in the far corner. 2 girls and a boy, coughing, sobbing, faces streaked with soot. "It's all right," Clara called gently, her voice steady though her lungs burned. "We're here to help. We'll take you out." The older girl looked up, her eyes wide with terror. "Mama and Papa," Clara's heart cracked, but she forced calm into her tone. "Sweetheart, we have to move now. Can you help me with your brother and sister?" Nawel was already lifting the youngest boy into his arms. "The roof is failing," he warned. "We have minutes." Clara clasped the hands of the girls, pulling them toward the stairs. The smoke clawed at her throat, and the groaning timbers above promised imminent collapse. But somehow, stumbling and half-blind, they emerged into the daylight just as the cabin's roof gave way behind them with a scream of sparks. They ran to the corral, shielding the children from the sight of their fallen parents. The eldest girl sobbed. "I want Mama." Clara knelt, gathering all 3 into her arms. "I know, darling, I know, but your Mama would want you safe. She'd want you brave." Nawel stood nearby, his face unreadable, yet something in his gaze had softened. He had seen courage before on battlefields, but rarely in the form of a schoolteacher dragging 2 children through fire. That night, they sheltered the children beneath a starlit sky. Their names were Sarah, Mary, and Tommy Patterson. They clung to Clara as though she were anchor in a storm. She soothed them with the same gentle patience she had once used in her classroom, whispering promises of safety, even as her own voice trembled. By dawn, Nawel made his decision. "We take them to Fort Bowie. Soldiers will protect them there." Clara stiffened. "Fort Bowie? That's where the Apache war chiefs are planning their strike, isn't it?" His eyes flickered. "You hear well." Later, in a hidden valley behind a thunderous waterfall, Clara learned the truth of him. Nawel's sanctuary was carved into stone, caves painted with ancient pictographs, shelves of pottery and weapons, even books in English and Spanish. He was no mere raider. He was a keeper of memory, a bridge between the past and the world crushing it. But sanctuary was fleeting. That night, 3 young Apache warriors came, their tattoos inked with firelight. They spoke rapidly with Nawel, their voices sharp, their glances often cutting toward Clara. She did not understand the words, but she understood the stakes. Afterward, Nawel explained, they plan to strike Fort Bowie within the week. They believe victory will inspire rebellion across the territory. Clara's blood turned to ice. "But the Patterson children, they'll be there. If the fort falls," he looked at her steadily, "then they die, along with soldiers, families, innocents." Her voice cracked. "You can stop this. Warn them. You know the land, the tactics. To warn them," he said, "is to betray my own. To stand against warriors who call me brother. To be named traitor. And if you don't," she pressed, "then children burn." His words were flat, heavy. The cave went silent. Clara stared at him, heart pounding. In his face she saw the fracture. Duty to blood on one side, the unbearable cost of that duty on the other. At last he stood. "I will go, even if my people curse my name, even if it costs my life, because honor is not measured by whom we kill, but by whom we save." Clara's throat tightened. She thought of the crowd in Copper Creek, willing to sacrifice her for their comfort. She thought of the children clinging to her in the cellar, and she thought of this man, feared across the territory as the blood hunter, choosing principle over vengeance. She whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe he isn't a monster after all." And so the course was set. Together they would ride into fire again, not as teacher and captive, not as Apache and white, but as two exiles bound by a truth larger than either tribe's hatred. And now I ask you, listeners, what would you choose? To protect the honor of your people, even if it meant the innocent died? Or to risk being branded traitor and save the very ones who once called you enemy? By the time Clara and Nawel reached the ridges overlooking Fort Bowie, the world below was already a cauldron of fire and death. The outpost blazed like a funeral pyre, smoke rising in thick black columns, the crack of rifles and the whistle of arrows mingling with the screams of horses and men. They had ridden hard for a night and a day, but they were too late. Nawel's face was stone as he surveyed the scene. 8, maybe 10 war parties, he muttered, voice tight with grief and calculation. They struck at dawn, barracks first, supply stores next. They want confusion before slaughter. Clara clutched the reins of her horse, her throat raw from dust and fear. "The children," she gasped. "The Patterson children, they're in there." "Then we go," Nawel said, wheeling his paint horse downslope. The air grew hotter as they neared the fort, sparks raining down like burning snow. Clara fought to stay low, dodging between fallen timbers and bodies. Nawel moved like a predator, every sense honed by a lifetime in battle. He carried his rifle with grim precision, firing only when it meant saving a life in front of him. At the far end of the compound, Clara heard it, the thin, desperate cries of children. The officers' quarters burned, its windows glowing with fire. Families were trapped inside. Without hesitation, Clara ran toward the doorway, coughing as smoke clawed her lungs. "Sarah! Mary! Tommy!" she shouted. Through the haze, 3 soot-streaked faces turned toward her, wide-eyed with terror. It was them. Nawel was beside her now, his shoulder already bleeding from a grazing bullet. He seized a fallen beam, muscles straining as he cleared a path. "Go!" he barked. Clara rushed in, gathering Mary into her arms while guiding Sarah and Tommy toward the door. Around them, women clutched infants. Old men stumbled half-blind, everyone choking in the inferno. Then Sergeant Morrison appeared, half-burned uniform hanging in tatters. He gaped when he saw Nawel. "Apache," he spat, raising his rifle. Clara threw herself between them. "He's here to save them," she cried. "Shoot him and you kill your only chance." For a heartbeat, Morrison hesitated. Behind him, timbers cracked as the roof sagged. Finally, he lowered his weapon. Together, he and Nahuel herded the survivors out into the courtyard. "Where now?" Clara gasped, clutching a coughing Mary. Nahuel pointed to a stone supply cellar at the far edge of the compound. "There, underground, thick walls. One entrance!" They staggered across open ground, arrows whistling past, bullets ricocheting from stone. Nahuel stumbled once, clutching his shoulder, but pushed forward, carrying the youngest boy in his arms. Somehow, impossibly, they reached the cellar. Morrison kicked the door open, shoving civilians inside. For a brief moment, there was safety in the cool dark of the underground chambers. But safety never lasted long on the frontier. Outside, voices rose in Apache. Warriors had seen them. Soon the door would be tested, and no wood could hold forever. When Nahuel emerged into the courtyard, 30 Apache warriors awaited him. At their head stood Mangus, a war chief marked with ritual scars, and Ayana, a young spiritual leader with fire painted across his cheeks. Their eyes burned not with surprise, but betrayal. "You," Mangus thundered. "You sent warning. You fight beside whites." Nahuel stood tall despite the blood darkening his shirt. "I fight for children," he said. "For life, not death. That is the greater honor." Ayana stepped forward, voice sharp with youthful conviction. "Life without honor is no life at all. Better we die as warriors than live as slaves to white men." The courtyard grew still. Clara, watching from the shadows, felt the weight of history pressing in. It was more than a battle. It was a clash of philosophies, of survival and glory. Nahuel's voice cut the silence. Children cannot eat honor. Widows cannot live on glory. My grandmother survived the long walk not by dying bravely, but by enduring so that our people still breathe today. What do you offer the next generation if we all fall here in fire? Mangus's face twisted with rage. Traitor, he spat. You shame your ancestors. Nawel did not flinch. I honor them by keeping their descendants alive. For a moment, the warriors wavered. The smoke thickened, screams echoed from the barricades, and the thunder of hooves rolled in from the horizon. Relief was coming. Cavalry. The bugle cry pierced the chaos as blue-coated riders swept into view, sabers gleaming, carbines raised. The war party knew their time was up. To fight meant annihilation. To retreat meant survival. Mangas snarled orders, rallying his men. They mounted swiftly, wheeling toward the eastern hills. Yet before leaving, the chief turned back to Nawel. His words carried both curse and respect. The path you choose will break you, he said. Neither white nor Apache will claim you. Every day you will earn trust anew, and every night both sides will whisper your name as betrayer. Nahuel inclined his head. Then let them whisper, so long as children sleep safely. And with that, Mangas led his warriors into the wilderness, their war cry echoing across the mountains before fading into silence. The cavalry stormed into the fort, driving back flames, tending the wounded, securing the broken stronghold. Colonel Hayes dismounted at the courtyard, his weathered face stern as he took in the sight. An Apache warrior standing unarmed, bloodied among white survivors. "Is this prisoner?" he asked sharply. Before Morrison could answer, Sarah Patterson stepped forward. Her face was streaked with soot, her voice trembling but strong. "He saved us. He carried Tommy when no one else could. Without him, we'd be dead." Mary clutched Clara's hand and piped up, "He's not a monster. He's our hero." The colonel paused, gaze flicking from the soot-stained children to Nahuel's unyielding stance. Slowly, he extended his hand. "Then let the record show. The man they call the Blood Hunter has saved American lives this day, and the Army recognizes courage, even from unexpected hands." For the first time, Clara saw Nahuel's hard features soften, just slightly. He accepted the handshake, not with triumph, but with the quiet dignity of a man who had sacrificed more than glory to protect life. Around them, the fort still smoldered, its wounded groaning, its future uncertain. Yet in that moment, with children alive who should have been dead, a new kind of history was being written, one not forged by conquest or revenge, but by the hard choice of mercy. And so, listeners, I put the question to you. If your honor demanded war, but your conscience demanded peace, what would you choose? When the smoke of Fort Bowie thinned and the dead were laid to rest, the Army offered Clara Morrison a way out. Colonel Hayes, moved by her courage, promised her a letter of recommendation and safe passage back to Denver, a chance to leave the dust and blood of Arizona behind. But Clara only shook her head. She looked out at the wide red desert, the jagged mountains rising like guardians of another world, and she knew Denver was no longer her place. "I came here to teach," she told the colonel. "That hasn't changed. Only now I see more clearly who needs a teacher most. The children, Apache and white alike. They deserve a future together, not divided by hate." And so Clara refused the safety of the city. Instead, she chose the uncertainty of the frontier, planting her roots in a land still soaked with conflict, determined to raise a school where laughter might replace gunfire and books replace chains. Nahuel, too, laid something to rest. No longer did he answer to the name whispered in fear, the Blood Hunter. That mask of savagery, built on rumor and weaponized by enemies, had served its purpose, but he was done being a symbol of terror. He chose instead to become something harder, something rarer, a protector, a teacher, a bridge between worlds that had long seen only enemies in each other's eyes. His scars remained, his reputation lingered, but his path turned from vengeance to preservation. Clara and Nahuel walked into their uncertain future side by side, carrying the children's trust as their shield and a stubborn faith as their compass. And in the end, it was not fire or steel that wrote their legacy, but the quiet decision to live when death would have been easier. For as Nawel once said, honor is not dying to prove you are right. Honor is living long enough to teach the next generation how to do what is right. That was the truest lesson the frontier had to give. And so, dear listeners, that is the story Mr. William Carter of Texas shared with Dust and Destiny. A tale of justice, of honor, and of the terrible choices demanded beneath the blazing sun of the western frontier. Clara Morrison, the disgraced schoolteacher who chose courage over silence. Nawel, the warrior who laid down the mantle of blood hunter to become something far greater. Their choices echo still across the canyons and into our own time. Do we cling to vengeance, or do we dare to build peace? Now I leave the question to you. Was Nawel a traitor to his people, or a hero who understood honor in its truest form? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story touched you, share it with a friend, subscribe to Dust and Destiny, and keep these voices of the Old West alive. And remember, if you have a story of your own, an old family legend, or a tale passed down in letters and whispers, send it to us by email. We'll tell it for you, so that the dust of time never buries the destiny of these forgotten lives. Because out here, in the land of red dust and endless sky, stories are the only monuments that last.